Sophia Bennet had never imagined her life would take this turn. After the tragic death of her parents, she found herself trapped in an arranged marriage to a man she didn't know. A man twice her age, wealthy and powerful, a stranger whose presence felt like a cage. But what awaited her on this unexpected path was far from what she expected. The man who should have been her captor turned out to be the one who would unlock a door she had kept sealed for years. But what happened next? No one could have predicted. If this story resonates with you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support keeps stories like these alive. After the tragic death of her parents, 19-year-old Sophia Bennet was sent to live with her uncle and aunt in Charleston, South Carolina. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a new chapter in her life, but it quickly became a harsh reality. Her relatives, while not cruel, treated her as an unwelcome guest. To them, she was an inconvenience, a burden that arrived with only the weight of her grief. She didn't belong in their home, nor in their lives. Every look, every word, reinforced the idea that she was nothing more than a responsibility they didn't ask for. The days stretched on, and the months passed in silence. Sophia kept to herself, her heart heavy with the loss of her parents. She couldn't quite shake the feeling of being a ghost in their home, an invisible presence that they tolerated but never truly embraced. The walls of her new home seemed to close in on her, and the air felt stifling, as though it had been forever tainted by the sorrow she carried. Her life, once filled with dreams and possibilities, now seemed like a never-ending series of obligations. The only respite came from the rare moments when she was allowed to retreat into her thoughts, to remember the life she once had, to mourn the future that would never be. Then, one fateful summer day, her life was turned upside down once again. Desperate for money, her uncle and aunt, who had always been too proud to admit their financial struggles, accepted an offer from Richard Callahan, a 49-year-old magnate. He was a man of immense wealth and power, known for his cold demeanor and his ruthless business dealings. In exchange for his financial assistance, Sophia was to marry him. It was a deal, a transaction. To her family, it was the only way to survive. Sophia's heart sank when she heard the news. She was being sold, no different than a pawn in a game of survival. The thought of marrying a man old enough to be her father, someone she didn't even know, filled her with dread. But she had no choice. Her fate had been sealed, and there was nothing she could do to change it. She was powerless, trapped by the decisions of those who should have cared for her the most. The days leading up to the wedding were a blur. The excitement and joy that typically accompany such an event were absent. Instead, there was a chilling sense of inevitability in the air. Sophia was a doll, dressed in a pristine wedding gown, her body a mere vessel for the promises made by others. She was not asked if this was what she wanted. No one cared. Her heart, once full of dreams, had withered under the weight of her family's choices. On the day of the wedding, Sophia's nerves were in shambles. As she stood at the altar, she felt as though she were in a dream, a nightmare to be precise. The church, grand and filled with guests, seemed distant, as though she were watching from afar. The music, the flowers, the smiles on the faces of those who attended, it all felt like a world she didn't belong to. Richard Callahan stood before her, his presence commanding yet detached. He was a man with the world at his feet, and yet there was something about him that unsettled her. His cold, calculating eyes scanned the room, and when they finally landed on her, they seemed to see right through her. She was not a woman to him, just a commodity, a means to an end. Yet something in his gaze made her pause. There was a calmness there, a stillness that both terrified and intrigued her. Was he truly as cold as she thought? Or was there more beneath the surface, something she couldn't yet understand? She couldn't help but wonder, but the fear was too great to allow her curiosity to flourish. As she exchanged vows with him, her voice barely audible, Sophia's thoughts drifted back to the life she had lost. How could she have ended up here? How could this be the future that awaited her? But there was no turning back. The ring was on her finger, and the promise of a future with a man she barely knew loomed before her. In the silence of the ceremony, a single tear fell from Sophia's eye, tracing the delicate curve of her cheek. It wasn't just for the life she had lost. It was for the woman she had yet to become. It was for the freedom she no longer had, for the future that seemed so uncertain. And yet, as she gazed at her reflection in the mirror before walking down the aisle, a fleeting thought crossed her mind. What if, in the end, I find some kind of peace on this path? It was a small hope, a fragile hope. But in that moment, it was the only thing that kept her from completely losing herself. There was no way of knowing what lay ahead, but somewhere deep within her, Sophia held on to the possibility that maybe, just maybe, there was something more to this life than the cage she had been thrust into. The day of the wedding arrived, and with it, a sense of dread that hung in the air like a storm cloud. Sophia, still dressed in her wedding gown, stood before the altar, her heart pounding in her chest. The once familiar church now felt foreign to her, its grandeur only serving to magnify her isolation. The weight of the situation was unbearable, and yet there was no escape. She was still a virgin, untouched and innocent, a girl who had barely begun to understand the world, now forced into a marriage she didn't want. There was no joy in her heart, only a suffocating sense of submission, of being led to a life she could neither control nor change. Her thoughts were consumed by one simple question: why? Why had this been chosen for her? Why had she been robbed of the chance to decide her own fate? As the ceremony began, her eyes flitted nervously around the room, avoiding the gaze of those who had gathered to witness this twisted union. The whispers, the glances, they all cut deeper than she could bear. Her uncle and aunt, who had arranged the marriage, sat in the front row, their faces masked with a satisfaction she couldn't understand. They had done what was necessary. They had ensured their own survival. But at what cost? Richard Callahan stood at the altar, his features set in an unreadable expression. He was the man she was supposed to marry, the man who would now control the rest of her life. At 49, Richard was years older than her, his life already established while hers had barely begun. His presence was commanding, his confidence intimidating, and yet, as she looked at him, there was an odd sense of distance between them. She could feel the divide, the chasm that separated them, one that no vows or promises could bridge. The officiant's words were drowned out by the rush of her own thoughts. Sophia had no choice but to go through with the ceremony, her body moving like a puppet whose strings had been pulled by others. Her voice, when it finally came, was a whisper, barely audible over the sound of her racing heart. "I do." It felt like a lie, a word that had no meaning, no weight. As Richard placed the ring on her finger, Sophia's heart sank. The symbol of her captivity now adorned her hand. She was bound, not by love, but by necessity, by an obligation that she had no say in. She tried to look at Richard, to see something in his eyes, but all she could see was the coldness that emanated from him. His gaze was distant, his face composed, but it was impossible for her to read him. The kiss that followed felt like an intrusion. When their lips met, there was no warmth, no spark. There was only a sense of finality, of an end to something that had never even begun. Richard's lips were firm, his touch too controlled, as though he were marking a moment of duty rather than desire. Sophia stood there, a frozen figure, feeling nothing but the emptiness of it all. As they walked down the aisle side by side, the weight of the world seemed to press down on Sophia's shoulders. The wedding, the ceremony, the promises, they were all just a blur. She felt like a ghost, drifting through the motions without truly being present in her own life. Her body moved mechanically, her mind still reeling from the events that had led her here. Later that night, as Sophia sat alone in the grand, unfamiliar bedroom, her mind raced. The silence of the mansion was deafening. She wondered if it would ever feel like home, or if she would always be a prisoner in a gilded cage, trapped by the decisions of those who had never asked her opinion. Sophia's heart ached as she thought of the life she had left behind, the life she would never have. She had once dreamed of love, of adventure, of a future she could shape with her own hands, but now that future had been stolen from her, replaced with a reality that felt foreign and cruel. And yet, in the stillness of the room, a single thought echoed in her mind. What if, despite all of this, I find a way to survive? What if I can make this life my own? Sophia lay awake in the grand bed, the moonlight casting long shadows across the room, painting the walls in shades of silver and blue. The mansion, once so intimidating, now felt like a cold, empty shell, echoing with the quiet hum of distant memories. The silence pressed in on her, heavier than it had ever been before, each minute stretching longer than the last. Her heart was racing, beating in her chest with a frantic rhythm that matched the restlessness in her mind. She couldn't stop thinking about what had happened earlier that day, the wedding, the vows, the promises she never asked for, the life she had been forced into. Tonight was supposed to be the first night of her marriage to Richard Callahan, the man who had, in the eyes of her family, saved them from ruin. But to Sophia, he was still a stranger who, by the sheer weight of his wealth and power, had been given ownership of her life, a man who now stood between her and the life she had once dreamed of, a life that seemed impossible now, so far out of reach. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being dragged into a world that didn't belong to her, and she wasn't sure if she could survive it. As she lay there, the bed too large, too foreign, her thoughts spun in endless circles. Her body was stiff with tension, her skin prickling from the unfamiliar fabric of the sheets. The scent of roses lingered faintly in the air, a remnant of the flowers from the wedding, but it did nothing to calm her nerves. Instead, it seemed to mock her, reminding her of the vows she had spoken not out of love, but out of necessity. She had promised to be his wife, to follow the path laid out before her, but the weight of the words felt like a chain around her neck. Her eyes flickered toward Richard, who was sitting at the edge of the bed, his broad shoulders hunched in quiet contemplation. He wasn't looking at her, but she could feel his presence, like a heavy cloud in the room. He was a man of power, of control, someone who had lived a life of ambition and success, and yet tonight he seemed to be as unsure of what to do as she was. He hadn't spoken much since they arrived at the mansion, only guiding her through the steps of the evening with calm precision. It was as though he too was waiting for something neither of them could control. The silence between them stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. Sophia's thoughts were racing. How could she even begin to live in this world with him? What would her life look like now? She had been a girl full of dreams, a girl who had imagined love, adventure, and the freedom to choose her own destiny. But now, she was trapped in a gilded cage, with no escape, no voice, nothing but the uncertainty of what the future would hold. And then, unexpectedly, Richard moved. He stood up from the edge of the bed, his footsteps quiet on the hardwood floor. Sophia tensed, her heart skipping a beat as she wondered if this was the moment when everything would change, when the promises of the day would be fulfilled, whether she was ready or not. But instead of coming closer, instead of taking control as she feared, Richard walked across the room to the sofa, settling down without a word. He was not moving toward her, not demanding what was his, as she had feared. "I'm not going to force you," he said, his voice low but firm, breaking the silence between them. "I'll sleep on the couch tonight." The words hit Sophia like a sudden breath of fresh air. His voice, calm and measured, didn't carry the authority she had expected. There was no command, no expectation in his tone, only a quiet understanding that took her completely off guard. She hadn't expected this, hadn't expected him to respect her space, to acknowledge her fear. He wasn't the man she had imagined, the man she had braced herself for. Instead, he was showing her a kindness she hadn't anticipated, a respect she hadn't been given in years. Sophia remained frozen for a long moment, unsure of what to make of his words. Part of her wanted to refuse, wanted to say something to make the situation feel more like a dream, more like a choice. But the other part of her, the part that was overwhelmed with the weight of everything, felt a strange sense of relief. She didn't know what it meant or what it would lead to, but for the first time since the marriage had been arranged, she felt as if she were in control of something, even if it was just the space between them. She lay back against the pillows, her eyes slowly closing, her mind still racing. Richard's soft breathing from across the room was the only sound in the otherwise silent mansion. The tension that had gripped her all day seemed to fade, replaced by a sense of fragile peace. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, didn't know how the rest of her life with Richard Callahan would unfold, but for the first time, there was a small flicker of hope, a tiny spark of something that felt like possibility. As she drifted off to sleep, the soft weight of exhaustion pulling her under, she couldn't shake the question that lingered in her mind. What will tomorrow bring? The days that followed Sophia's wedding were filled with uncertainty and confusion. She had expected the mansion to be a cold, oppressive place, but something unexpected had happened. Richard Callahan, the man she had married out of obligation, had not been the distant, domineering figure she had feared. Instead, he had shown her a kindness that left her both confused and unsettled. It started with small gestures. Flowers placed by the side of her bed, thoughtful notes tucked into the folds of her clothes, meals prepared with care and attention to detail. Richard's actions were never grand or excessive, but they were consistent. Every day, he treated her with a respect that felt almost foreign to her. He never pushed her, never demanded anything, and yet there was a quiet insistence in his actions, a silent message that he wasn't the man she had imagined. He wasn't just a wealthy stranger she was married to. He was someone who seemed to genuinely care about her well-being, someone who, despite the circumstances, wanted to make her feel at home. Sophia had never been treated like this before. She had grown up in a household where love was absent, where her worth was measured by what she could provide or endure. Her parents, though loving in their own way, had never been able to protect her from the harsh realities of their world. And now, with her uncle and aunt, she had learned to expect nothing but indifference. She had come to believe that she was undeserving of love, that no one would ever see her as more than a burden. But Richard was different. His actions were simple, yet they carried weight. When she had been sick with a cold one morning, he had insisted on making her tea himself, carefully choosing the right herbs, his brow furrowed in concentration as he worked to make her comfortable. He had even refused to let her help, telling her that it was his privilege to take care of her, a privilege he had never experienced in his own life. At first, Sophia didn't know how to respond to this. Her emotions were a tangle of confusion and fear. She didn't know how to navigate this new dynamic, this unfamiliar territory where kindness and respect seemed to grow without explanation. She had never been given this before. She had always been the one who had to give, to serve, to sacrifice. To be the one receiving was an alien concept, one she wasn't sure how to accept. And yet, despite the unease she felt, there was something else growing inside her, a hesitant, fragile feeling that she couldn't quite name. It was as if Richard's kindness was a door opening inside of her, a door she hadn't known was closed. She wanted to trust him, to believe that this wasn't just a ploy, a manipulation of some kind. But deep down, she was still terrified. terrified that she would open herself up to him, only to have the door slammed shut, only to find that everything she had come to believe about him, about men like him, was true. One evening after dinner, Sophia sat in the drawing room, her fingers nervously tracing the rim of her teacup. Richard was across from her, reading the newspaper, his face soft and contemplative in the lamplight. The silence between them was comfortable, but there was an undercurrent of tension, a question hanging in the air that neither of them had yet addressed. Richard glanced up from his paper, his gaze meeting hers. "You've been quiet tonight," he said, his voice gentle but probing. "Is everything all right?" Sophia hesitated, unsure of how to respond. Part of her wanted to tell him everything, the weight of her fear, the confusion that had taken root in her heart. But another part of her, the part that had learned to stay quiet and protect herself, urged her to keep her distance, to protect herself from the vulnerability that she feared would only lead to more disappointment. "I'm just adjusting," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard nodded as though he understood, and for a moment, the room was silent again. Sophia felt a strange mix of relief and discomfort. She wanted to say more, to ask him about his own life, his own past, but the words seemed to stick in her throat. There was so much she wanted to know, so much she wanted to understand. And yet, every time she looked at him, she felt a wall rising up between them, a wall that neither of them had built, but that had always been there between them, waiting to be breached. Richard's voice broke the silence once more, and this time there was a softness in it that she hadn't heard before. "You don't have to be afraid, Sophia. I'm not here to hurt you." The sincerity in his words hit her harder than she expected. She wanted to believe him more than anything, but trust wasn't something she could give away easily. It had been taken from her too many times to be offered so freely. Still, despite her fear, despite the walls she had built around her heart, a small part of her, a part she had buried deep inside, began to hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, this could be the beginning of something new, something better. Dinner that night was a quiet affair. The air between Sophia and Richard had shifted again, this time in a way that felt deeper, more vulnerable. Richard had been patient with her, always offering kindness and respect, but there was something in his gaze tonight that made her feel as though he were waiting for her to say something, to open up, to share a part of herself she had kept hidden for so long. Sophia hadn't expected this level of attention, this level of care. For most of her life, she had been ignored, neglected by those who were supposed to care for her. Her parents, while kind in their own way, were distant and preoccupied, too caught up in their own struggles to fully see her. And now, with Richard, a man she had been forced to marry, she felt both grateful and confused by his constant acts of kindness. The truth was, Sophia didn't know how to respond to it. She had never been treated with this much attention, never been given so much care. It was overwhelming, and at times it felt suffocating. She couldn't help but wonder what Richard saw in her, what he expected from her. Why was he being so kind when others before him had only seen her as a burden? That night, as they sat together in the drawing room, the silence grew heavy. Sophia could feel Richard's eyes on her, but she couldn't meet his gaze. She didn't know how to begin, didn't know how to explain the weight of the past that still clung to her. It was all she had known for so long. But for some reason, tonight felt different. There was a tenderness in the air, an unspoken invitation for her to share. Finally, the words escaped her lips, barely above a whisper. "I was never meant to be loved, Richard." "Not really." Richard's expression softened, and he leaned in slightly, his gaze steady and understanding. "What do you mean by that?" Sophia closed her eyes, gathering the courage to speak of the pain she had buried so deep inside. "I grew up with my parents, yes. But love was something that was always out of reach. They were good people, but they weren't there for me in the way I needed. And when they died, When they were gone, my relatives didn't see me as family. They saw me as an obligation. I was nothing more than a means to an end. Sophia's voice cracked as she spoke, the weight of the words catching in her throat. They didn't care for me. They cared for what I could bring to them. When I was taken in by them, it wasn't because they wanted me. It was because they needed money. And they sold me to you, Richard, like I was nothing more than a prize to be exchanged. She could feel the tears welling up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had cried too many times before. She had allowed her tears to define her, to make her feel weak, and she wasn't going to do that now. Not in front of him. Richard remained silent for a long time. His presence was steady, unwavering, as though he was absorbing every word, every emotion she had poured into him. And then, slowly he spoke, his voice filled with a quiet indignation that shocked her. "That's unforgivable," he said softly. "You should have never been treated like that. You deserve so much more." Sophia shook her head, her voice trembling. "It doesn't matter now. I can't change it. All I've ever known is being used, being sold, being traded. And I thought that's all I would ever be. I didn't think I was worth anything else." Richard's expression grew hard for a moment, as though he were angry, not at her, but at the injustice she had endured. His eyes softened again as he reached out and took her hand in his. "You're wrong, Sophia. You're worth everything. No one has the right to make you feel less than that." The sincerity in his words hit her harder than she expected. She had never been told she was worth anything before. She had always been the one to sacrifice, to give without receiving. But Richard was different. He wasn't just telling her empty words. He was showing her, through his actions and his presence, that she mattered. Sophia closed her eyes, her heart swelling with emotions she didn't know how to handle. She had never allowed herself to believe in kindness like this, never allowed herself to trust that someone might actually care for her. But something in Richard's touch, in his words, made her want to believe. For the first time in her life, she wanted to believe that she was worth something. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never knew what it felt like to be seen." Richard's thumb gently brushed across her hand, and he gave her a small, tender smile. "You're seen, Sophia. You're seen by me." And for the first time, in that small moment, she felt like she wasn't alone. The days following their intimate dinner felt like a turning point for both of them. Richard had continued to show Sophia kindness, small acts of respect that slowly peeled back the layers of her mistrust. But there was a quiet weight to the air, an unspoken truth that hung between them. Sophia felt it, though she couldn't quite place her finger on it. It was as if there were more to Richard than he was letting on, something deeper, something darker. She hadn't realized how much she wanted to know about him, how much she needed to understand the man she had married, until one evening when Richard unexpectedly invited her to join him in the study. It was a rare moment, one where he seemed willing to let her in, to offer a piece of himself that had been kept hidden from her. They sat by the fire, the room filled with the warmth of the crackling flames and the smell of old books. The tension between them had softened, but the question remained. Why was he being so kind? Was there more to him than the cold, commanding magnate that everyone in Charleston feared? Richard poured them both a glass of wine, his movements smooth and deliberate. For a moment, Sophia watched him, wondering if this was another test, another measure of her ability to trust. But there was something different about him now, something that made her feel like he was no longer the stranger he had once been. "Why do you never talk about yourself, Richard?" she asked, her voice tentative. "You've told me about your business, your achievements, but nothing about you, about your life before me." Richard's eyes softened for a moment, and for the first time, she saw a hint of something vulnerable behind his stoic exterior. He took a deep breath, the lines of his face softening as he set the wine glass down on the table. "I suppose I've never really had the luxury of sharing much about myself," he said quietly. "There was never much time for that in my life. Everything was always about power, about winning, about succeeding. I grew up in a house where love wasn't given freely. My father believed in only one thing: dominance. He taught me that the world respected power, and that was the only thing worth pursuing." Sophia listened intently, her heart pounding in her chest. There was a rawness in his voice that she hadn't expected, a depth of pain she had never imagined. "My father was a man who had everything," Richard continued, his voice steady, though his words carried a weight that Sophia could feel. "But he was never truly happy. Success never filled the emptiness he carried inside. I spent my entire youth trying to earn his approval, trying to become the man he wanted me to be. And when he passed away, I realized something important, that power, money, success, none of it ever brought me peace." Sophia could see the conflict in his eyes, the silent battle between the man he had been and the man he was trying to become. She didn't know what to say, but she could feel the rawness of his words, the truth he had been hiding for so long. "I've spent my life building empires, Sophia," Richard continued, his voice softening even more. "But what I've built has never made me feel fulfilled. I thought that if I could conquer everything, I would finally find peace. But all I found was a deeper loneliness, a void that couldn't be filled by anything I had achieved." The vulnerability in his voice took her by surprise. Sophia had never expected this from him, this man who had seemed so confident, so untouchable. She had only seen the surface, the businessman, the magnate. But now she was seeing the man beneath it all, the man who had struggled, who had lost more than he had gained. Sophia felt a pang of empathy for him, something she had never expected to feel. She understood in that moment that they were not so different after all. She too had lived a life where the pursuit of happiness had always seemed like a distant dream, something that belonged to others, not to her. "But what does this have to do with me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard looked at her then, his gaze steady and filled with something she hadn't expected: hope. "Everything," he said softly. "You gave me a glimpse of something different, Sophia. A glimpse of peace. Something I never knew I needed until you were here. I thought power was the only thing that mattered, but now I see that there's something else, something more important. And I want to try and find that with you." The words hung between them, fragile and tentative. In that moment, Sophia realized that she had been given something she had never expected, a glimpse of the man Richard could be, the man he was willing to become. And for the first time, she felt a spark of hope. Perhaps this marriage, this life, could be something more than she had ever dreamed. Perhaps together they could build something that went beyond power and status, something real. The days passed in a soft blur, each one blending into the next. The mansion, once an imposing and cold structure, had begun to feel more like a home, though a quiet one. Sophia had started to find comfort in the small, everyday moments. She would wake up in the mornings to find Richard already gone, off to his business meetings or his work, but his absence was always followed by a reminder of his presence. Flowers appeared on the table, a hot cup of tea waiting for her, or a small note tucked into her coat pocket with a simple message: "Hope your day is peaceful." At first, she couldn't understand why Richard was doing this, why he was going out of his way to show kindness, to make her feel cared for when they had been bound together by nothing more than a contract. But as the days stretched on, Sophia began to notice a shift within herself. Something that had once felt so foreign, so impossible, was starting to feel natural. Their interactions, while still cautious, had become more frequent. The first few moments after their wedding had been filled with silence, with awkward exchanges and unspoken tension. But now, in the quiet corners of their home, their touch had begun to change. It wasn't the intense, desperate touch of lovers, but something softer, tentative, exploratory. A hand grazing a shoulder, a finger brushing against the back of her hand when she handed him something. The slightest of touches, but they carried weight, more weight than she had ever realized. Sophia was still afraid, still unsure of what it all meant. But she couldn't ignore the small, fluttering feeling that rose in her chest each time Richard's touch lingered a moment longer than expected. There was something about it that made her heart race, a spark that she couldn't quite explain. One evening, as they sat together in the drawing room, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls, Richard reached across the table, his fingers brushing lightly over hers. It was so simple, so gentle, but the electricity between them was palpable. For a moment, neither of them moved, the air thick with unspoken words. Sophia could feel her pulse quicken, her breath hitching in her throat. The world outside the room seemed to fade away, leaving only the warmth of his touch. Richard, sensing her hesitation, didn't push. He kept his hand there, just barely touching hers, as though giving her the space to decide. Sophia wasn't sure what to do. Her mind told her to pull away, to remain distant, to keep her heart closed. But her body, her heart, were telling her something else. They were telling her to lean into this, to allow herself to feel something she had never allowed herself to feel before. She swallowed hard, her voice barely a whisper as she spoke. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her eyes meeting his. The question hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Richard's gaze softened, and for the first time she saw vulnerability in his eyes. "I don't know how to explain it," he admitted quietly, "but I want to get to know you, Sophia, not just as my wife, but as you. I've spent my whole life building walls around myself, around everything I've ever known, but with you, it feels different. It feels like I'm finally seeing something real." Sophia's heart skipped a beat. She had never heard anyone speak to her like this. Not her parents, not her family, and certainly not the man she had married out of obligation. Richard was telling her something she had never allowed herself to believe, that she was worth something, that she could be loved, not because of what she could give, but simply because of who she was. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she held them back, unwilling to let her vulnerability show just yet. "I don't know how to be what you want me to be," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I don't know how to be loved, Richard. I've never been taught how." Richard's thumb gently stroked the back of her hand, the tenderness in the gesture a quiet promise. "You don't have to be anything for me, Sophia. You just have to be yourself." In that moment, everything seemed to shift. The room felt warmer, lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. Sophia wasn't sure if it was love, but it was something that felt real, something that made her believe that maybe, just maybe, there could be a future for her in this marriage, a future that wasn't bound by duty, but by something deeper. As the evening wore on, Richard didn't move his hand away. Neither of them spoke for a while, letting the silence fill the space between them. But the silence was no longer uncomfortable. It was a silence of understanding, of two people beginning to break down the walls they had built around themselves. Sophia knew there was still so much to learn about Richard, about herself, about this marriage, but for the first time since she had been forced into this life, she felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe this journey, though unexpected, could lead her to a place of peace, of trust, of love. The days had begun to feel less like a blur and more like a routine, a new unfamiliar rhythm that Sophia had to adapt to. She had come to expect Richard's small acts of kindness, the quiet gestures that seemed to show that he genuinely cared about her well-being. He continued to treat her with respect, never rushing her, never pressuring her into something she wasn't ready for. And though there were moments of tension, moments when she felt the weight of their situation more than others, Sophia was beginning to feel something she hadn't felt in a long time, a tentative sense of safety. But with that safety came vulnerability, a vulnerability that opened the door to fears she had long buried deep inside. One night, as the moonlight filtered in through the heavy curtains of their bedroom, Sophia woke up with a start. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her heart pounding in her chest as the remnants of a nightmare clung to her like a shroud. She could still feel the panic, the sense of being trapped in a cage, unable to escape. Her parents' faces had been in the nightmare, their voices accusing her, blaming her for their deaths. And then there was the feeling of being alone, utterly alone, lost in a world that didn't care about her. It was a dream she had had before, a recurring one that always left her shaken. But tonight, it was different. This time, the nightmare had felt too real, too close. She couldn't shake the feeling that something inside her was unraveling, something she couldn't control. Sitting up in bed, she drew her knees to her chest, her arms wrapping around herself as she fought to calm her breathing. She closed her eyes, trying to steady her mind, but the images from the nightmare still lingered at the edges of her consciousness. The fear was too strong, and her body trembled as though the terror of the dream hadn't ended when she woke. It was then that she heard footsteps in the hallway, soft but distinct. Sophia's heart skipped a beat. She had hoped to be alone, to ride out the storm of her fear in silence, but the presence outside the door seemed to be getting closer. A gentle knock sounded on the door, followed by Richard's voice. "Sophia, are you all right?" Her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected him to be so perceptive, to notice the shift in her energy so quickly. She wiped her tears away, but the vulnerability she was feeling felt too raw, too exposed. She wasn't sure if she was ready for him to see this side of her, the side that still carried the weight of the past. But Richard's voice was calm, understanding. "It's okay, Sophia. I'm not going to ask what's wrong, but I'm here if you need me." With hesitation, she stood and made her way to the door, opening it just a crack. Richard stood on the other side, his expression soft, his eyes filled with concern. There was no judgment, no expectation, just an offering of comfort. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want to wake you." Richard stepped forward, his presence steady and comforting. "You didn't wake me. I'm glad you opened the door." He didn't push her, didn't ask her to explain, but his hand reached out toward her in the stillness. His touch, warm and firm, gently cupped her face. Sophia closed her eyes at the contact, feeling his warmth seep into her skin, his presence grounding her in a way she hadn't expected. "It's okay to be afraid," Richard said, his voice low and soothing. "You don't have to hide from it, Sophia. You don't have to face it alone." The sincerity in his words struck her deeply. For the first time, she felt as though she didn't have to carry this burden on her own. She had spent so many years hiding her pain, burying it deep inside, but here, in this moment, Richard wasn't asking her to do that anymore. He wasn't asking her to be perfect, to have it all figured out. He was simply offering her a hand, an understanding that she wasn't alone in this. With a quiet sob, Sophia allowed herself to lean into his touch. The weight of her nightmares, of her fears, of the years she had spent hiding from her past, all seemed to melt away in that moment. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or what their future together would look like. But for the first time, she allowed herself to feel safe, really safe in his presence. Richard's hand moved gently from her face to her back, pulling her into an embrace. "I'm here," he whispered. "I'll always be here." Sophia let herself fall into his arms, her body trembling with the release of emotions she had kept locked away for too long. She didn't know if it was love or if it was simply the comfort of shared humanity, but in that moment, she felt something new begin to grow between them. It wasn't a grand gesture, it wasn't a declaration of love, but it was something real, something that couldn't be faked. As Richard held her, she felt the weight of the night ease just a little. the darkness receding, replaced by the warmth of his embrace. And for the first time in a long time, Sophia allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could find peace here. The days continued to unfold slowly, quietly, each one layering upon the next as Richard and Sophia navigated their new reality together. In the grand mansion, the stillness that had once been suffocating began to feel different. It wasn't an emptiness anymore, it was simply a quiet space where for the first time in her life, Sophia could breathe without fear of judgment or rejection. Richard had allowed her to see a side of him that she hadn't expected, a kindness that she hadn't anticipated, and as the days went by, Sophia found herself beginning to soften in response to him. The tension between them, once heavy and unspoken, began to shift into something else, something more comfortable. They had started to share small moments, laughing over meals, sitting in the garden together in silence, simply being near one another. There were still boundaries between them, lines neither of them was willing to cross just yet. But there was a quiet understanding that lingered in the air. They were finding their way toward each other, one step at a time. It wasn't just the physical distance that had started to change. It was emotional. Richard's quiet patience had cracked open something inside Sophia that she hadn't realized was closed off. She was learning to trust him, to believe that his kindness wasn't an illusion, that he wasn't just playing a part in this strange marriage they had been thrust into. But despite the growing connection between them, Sophia still couldn't shake the lingering fear inside her. What would it mean if she let herself fully surrender to this? Could she truly trust him, or was she simply projecting the love she had never received onto someone who was, in essence, a stranger? One evening, after a quiet dinner, Richard invited her to walk with him by the garden. The air was crisp, the stars twinkling above them like diamonds scattered across the night sky. As they strolled together, the sounds of their footsteps the only noise between them, Sophia felt a strange pull toward him, a pull she couldn't explain, but that she had started to recognize. The night was peaceful, the world outside their small corner of it fading into the background. It was a perfect moment, one that made Sophia feel like maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to feel something deeper than the surface connection they had been sharing. Richard stopped walking suddenly, turning to face her. His expression was soft, but there was an intensity in his eyes that she hadn't seen before. "Sophia," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant, "I've been patient with you. I've given you time to heal, to adjust. But I need to know if you feel something, anything." Sophia's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't realized how much she had been holding back until now, how much she had been afraid to truly let herself feel. She wanted to speak, to tell him that yes, she felt something, but the words stuck in her throat. She wasn't sure if she was ready to admit it, to say it out loud. But Richard seemed to sense her hesitation. Slowly, gently, he took her hand in his touch light but firm. There was no rush, no urgency in the way he held her, but there was something in his touch that made her heart race. She felt her breath quicken, her body responding to his nearness in a way she hadn't anticipated. "Don't be afraid," he whispered, his voice a comforting murmur in the quiet night. "I'm not asking for everything at once. Just be honest with me. Tell me how you feel." The words she had been holding inside of her for so long seemed to break free all at once. The vulnerability she had been so afraid of now felt like a small price to pay for the possibility of something real, something that could fill the emptiness she had carried for so long. "I don't know how to trust," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't know if I can. I've never been loved the way you love me. I don't know if I can let myself feel it." Richard's thumb gently traced the back of her hand, the gesture tender and understanding. "You don't have to have all the answers, Sophia. You don't have to trust me completely right now. But I need you to know that I'm here. I won't force you to do anything you're not ready for. I just want you to know that I'm not going anywhere. Her heart swelled in her chest, the simple sincerity of his words hitting her harder than she expected. And before she could second-guess herself, she leaned forward, pressing her lips gently to his. It wasn't a passionate kiss, nor was it desperate. It was soft, tentative, as if both of them were stepping into something new, something uncharted. But it was real. It was honest. And in that single moment, Sophia felt something stir inside her, a connection, a promise, an unspoken understanding. When they pulled apart, neither of them spoke right away. The silence between them was comfortable now, no longer filled with tension or uncertainty, but with the shared knowledge of what had just passed between them. Sophia looked up at Richard, her eyes meeting his, and in them she saw the same vulnerability that she felt inside herself. "I think," she whispered, "I'm ready." And for the first time, Sophia allowed herself to believe that love, real love, could be more than a fleeting fantasy. It could be a beginning. As the weeks passed, the cold walls of the mansion that had once loomed over Sophia began to soften. What had been an oppressive space, filled with the echoes of strangers and silence, slowly became a place she could call home. It wasn't the grand mansion that made it feel like a home, nor the possessions that filled its many rooms. It was the small moments, the quiet gestures, the fleeting moments of affection from Richard that made it feel safe. For the first time since she had arrived, Sophia began to believe that she could find peace here, even if she hadn't chosen this life for herself. Her life with Richard was not filled with the grandeur and passion that she had once imagined a marriage might hold. There were no sweeping declarations of love or grand romantic gestures. Instead, their days were marked by quiet companionship. Richard, with his patient understanding and quiet kindness, had begun to give Sophia the space she needed to open up. He didn't demand her trust or her affection, but he had earned it in ways she hadn't expected. Sophia's routine had become almost comforting. She woke up early every morning with the sunlight streaming through the windows, casting soft rays over the room. She would dress for the day, and as she made her way downstairs, Richard would always be there, already having breakfast ready, a cup of tea waiting for her, just the way she liked it. It was the kind of normalcy she had never known, but it was the kind that had begun to root itself in her heart. Their days were filled with small conversations, shared moments in the garden, and evenings spent in the study or by the fire. Richard would read to her, his voice steady and soothing as he spoke of things from his past, his work, his life. And with every story, Sophia learned more about him. Not just the magnate everyone feared, but the man who, beneath it all, had lived through his own struggles, his own losses. He had known pain too, he had known loneliness too. But it wasn't just his stories that filled the silence. It was the way he listened to hers. Sophia had begun to open up to him about her past, about the years of feeling invisible and unloved, about the rejection she had faced from the family that had taken her in. She had never spoken of it to anyone before, but with Richard, it felt different. She wasn't afraid that he would judge her or pity her. Instead, his quiet presence, his unwavering gaze, made her feel seen, understood. He never pushed her to share more than she was ready to, but there was always an invitation there, an invitation to trust. They never spoke of love, not directly. It wasn't something either of them had voiced, but the quiet moments between them, the small acts of tenderness, began to say more than words ever could. Richard's touch, his gentle presence, became her comfort. When she woke in the middle of the night with the remnants of a nightmare still clinging to her, Richard was always there. His hand on her shoulder, his voice murmuring soothing words as he held her close, telling her that she was safe now. There were no grand promises, no sweeping gestures, but in those small, intimate moments, Sophia felt something real beginning to grow between them. It wasn't just affection, it was a quiet understanding that needed no words to be expressed. They had learned over time to live together in this new reality. Their routine was simple, but it was their own. There were no expectations, no pressure, just a gentle rhythm of shared time. In the evenings, they would walk together around the garden, Richard's arm around her waist, his voice asking her about her day, his smile warm, sincere. It was in these small moments that Sophia began to understand what love could look like, not the grand, sweeping love of fairy tales, but the steady, enduring love that grew quietly, over time, between two people who chose to care for one another, day by day. The mansion, once an empty house full of echoes, had slowly become a home, and it was no longer just the place where Sophia had been forced to live. It was a place where she could find peace, where she could find a part of herself she had long lost: hope. Richard had given her that gift, not through his wealth, not through his status, but through his patience, his respect, and his unwavering kindness. He had given her a place where she could be herself. And in return, Sophia had begun to let go of the fears that had kept her heart closed for so long. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing: she wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time in her life, she believed that she could truly start living. Months passed, and life in the mansion continued its quiet rhythm, each day building on the last. Sophia had grown accustomed to the peaceful existence that had blossomed between her and Richard. There was an undeniable bond between them now, one that had formed slowly, over time, in the small moments of shared affection and understanding. What had once been a marriage of necessity had slowly become something much more profound. There was no defining moment when it had shifted, no grand gesture, but rather a quiet, growing connection that had woven their lives together in ways neither of them had expected. But even as they found their rhythm, even as they began to feel like a family, life had a way of surprising them both. Sophia had known for some time that she was expecting a child, a fact that had both excited and terrified her in equal measure. She had felt the shift in her body, the way it responded to the life growing inside of her, and yet there was a part of her that still couldn't quite believe it. She hadn't had the time to prepare for motherhood. She hadn't had the chance to think about what it would mean to bring a child into this world, a world that she had only recently begun to make her own. And yet, as the days passed, she found herself embracing the idea of motherhood in a way she hadn't expected. Richard, for his part, had been nothing short of supportive. He had changed in ways Sophia hadn't thought possible. The man who had once been distant and guarded was now full of tenderness, his hand always on her back, his voice always calm and steady, reassuring her that everything would be okay. He had taken it upon himself to ensure she had everything she needed, both for herself and for the child. He had made the decision to be fully present for her, to be there for every moment, every step, every change. And then, one quiet evening, the inevitable happened. Sophia went into labor. The night was quiet, the air cool as she felt the first waves of pain wash over her. It came slowly at first, a dull ache that gradually intensified, tightening her body with every passing moment. She had been prepared for the pain, or at least she thought she had, but nothing could prepare her for the overwhelming feeling of fear and excitement that flooded her as she realized this was truly happening. She was about to give birth to Richard's child, their child, the product of everything they had shared in this uncertain yet profound journey. Richard was by her side, as always, his calm demeanor giving her a sense of peace amidst the storm of emotions inside her. He had never left her side, not for a moment, and as the contractions became stronger, as the pain intensified, his presence was the one thing she could hold on to. He whispered words of encouragement to her, holding her hand, his voice steady as he reassured her that everything would be fine. His presence was a rock, grounding her in the midst of the chaos. The hours stretched on, each moment a blur of pain and anticipation. Sophia had never imagined that labor would be like this, so raw, so intense, so life-altering. But in the midst of it, she felt a shift within herself. This was the culmination of everything she had feared, everything she had struggled with, and yet there was a profound beauty in it. There was the undeniable truth that in this moment she was about to bring new life into the world, a life that would forever tie her to Richard. And then, finally, it happened. Their son was born. Sophia couldn't stop the tears that welled up in her eyes as she held the tiny, squirming baby in her arms for the first time. He was perfect, so small and fragile, and yet he carried with him the promise of something new, a future, a family, a beginning. Richard, standing beside her, his eyes wide with awe, gently took the baby from her arms, cradling him with a reverence that sent a shiver down Sophia's spine. She watched as Richard's face softened, his features transformed by the overwhelming love he felt for this tiny being they had created together. It was a moment of pure, unfiltered joy, one that Sophia would carry with her forever. "You've given me everything, Sophia," Richard whispered, his voice thick with emotion as he gazed down at their son. "A family, a home, a future." Sophia smiled, tears streaming down her face. She had never felt so complete, so whole. In that moment, everything, the pain, the fear, the uncertainty, faded away. There was only this, only their son. And the love that had grown between her and Richard, a love that had been nurtured through patience, kindness, and the quiet moments that had bound them together. As Richard held their son close, Sophia couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. She had come so far from the girl who had been forced into this life, so far from the woman who had once believed she was unworthy of love. She had found something more than she had ever imagined, something worth fighting for, something worth living for. And in that moment, Sophia knew with all her heart that the journey they had started together was only just beginning. The days that followed the birth of their son were filled with a new kind of joy, a joy that was unexpected, raw, and incredibly real. Sophia's world had shifted in a way she hadn't anticipated, and as she watched Richard hold their child, she realized that the man she had married out of necessity was not the man she had come to know. He was so much more than she had ever imagined. He was gentle, attentive, and completely captivated by their son. Their home, once a place of silence and distance, had become alive with the sounds of a growing family. The cries of their newborn, the soft laughter shared between Richard and Sophia, and the quiet moments of tenderness had turned the mansion into something else entirely, a home. It was no longer just a house where she lived. It was a place where she was finally free to be who she was, to feel the love she had once thought impossible. Sophia's heart was full in a way she had never known. She looked at their son, the tiny creature who had changed everything, and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Her life had not been easy, and it had never been what she had imagined, but this moment made it all worth it. She had come from a place of fear and uncertainty, from a past filled with pain, but she had built something new. She had found a love she never expected, a family she never thought she would have. Richard was not the man he had once been either. The cold, distant magnate who had ruled over his world with power and control had softened, transformed by the love he had found in Sophia and their son. She saw it in the way he looked at her, in the way he held their baby, in the quiet moments where he simply sat by her side, as if content just to be with her. In the quiet of the night, after the baby had been fed and rocked to sleep, Richard and Sophia sat together by the fire. The room was bathed in the soft glow of the flames, and for a moment there was nothing but the sound of their breathing, the quiet warmth of their shared space. Richard reached for her hand, his fingers entwining with hers, and looked into her eyes with an intensity that took her breath away. "I've spent my whole life building empires, chasing something I thought would make me happy," Richard said softly. "But it was always empty. Until you. Until this." Sophia squeezed his hand, her heart full. "I never thought I could have this. I never thought I could feel loved like this. You've shown me a life I never dreamed possible." Richard's voice dropped to a whisper, his eyes never leaving hers. "You are everything I never knew I needed, Sophia. I don't know how I can repay you for this, for giving me a family, a home, a future." Sophia's chest tightened as tears filled her eyes. She had never expected this. She had never believed that she could have this kind of love, this kind of life. But here, with Richard and their son, she had everything she had ever dreamed of and more. And in that moment she knew this was what it meant to truly live. As the fire crackled softly, Richard leaned in and kissed her, a kiss that was gentle yet filled with an unspoken promise. It wasn't a promise of perfection, nor was it a promise of a life without hardship. But it was a promise of something real, something they had built together, piece by piece, through their shared pain, their quiet moments, their love. They had come so far from where they had started, from the forced marriage, from the fears that had once held them both captive, to this place of peace, of love and of family. Their journey had not been easy, but it had been worth every step. Sophia looked at Richard, her heart swelling with love. "I never imagined this life, but I'm so grateful for it, for you." Richard smiled, his eyes filled with a love she had never expected. "And I'm grateful for you, Sophia, for everything you've given me. You've shown me what it means to love, to truly love. And I promise, from this day forward, I will never take that for granted." With their son sleeping peacefully in the next room and the warmth of their love filling the air, Sophia knew that the pain of her past had finally been replaced with something far greater, something that would last forever. This was the end of a cycle of pain and the beginning of something beautiful, something full of hope. As she rested her head on Richard's shoulder, she closed her eyes and whispered, "Together, forever." And in that moment, Sophia knew that their love would endure through every challenge, every joy, and every step of the journey ahead. Together, they had found their home, their family, their future. And it was more than she had ever dreamed possible. Sometimes, life leads us down unexpected paths where the choices we didn't make become the most transformative. Sophia began her journey without knowing what to expect, forced into a marriage with a stranger, but she ended up discovering that love can blossom where you least expect it. Together, she and Richard rebuilt their lives, healing old wounds and creating something stronger than any obstacle. Because in the end, what really matters is not the beginning, but what we choose to build along the way. If this story touched your heart, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments. Where are you listening from? Your support is what keeps our channel alive, sharing stories that move us.